What's going on, everybody? It's Erica with Not Your Average EDC, and today we are going to talk about requirements that I have for my EDC folders. That has changed quite a bit since last year, and I made a video kind of like this last year, basically going over the necessities, like what I need from a folder. And now that I've changed jobs since last year, I am no longer in like the construction, renovation, really hard use field. I'm working at a farm now, very, very different. So what I need from my blades has completely changed. And I just wanted to go over, what boxes need to be checked for me and kind of just what has changed in the past year. So last year, like I mentioned, I was doing house renovations and carpentry and construction and landscaping and just really hard use. I was in a really hard use field, basically. And my knife was kind of required to be not only a cutting tool, but also a multi-tool. I'm sorry if you don't agree with that, but it is what it is. And so last year, the 940 and the Mini A100 were like my ultimate EDC knives. These were the best of the best for me when I was in that field. I tested both of these when I was doing that type of work. They did fantastic, and a lot of people would not agree with that because both of these blades are very thick and they don't have a lot of height to them in terms of this area. So see how short that is, which makes it pretty thick behind the edge and kind of stubby in comparison to something like a Para 3 where we have a lot of height, a lot of room for that blade to thin out and become more slicey. So when you're using your knife for something other than a cutting and slicing tool, you kind of want them to be a little less wide in this dimension because you want it to have that robust, thick edge if you're doing any type of drilling or prying, scraping, anything like that. So when I was doing construction and stuff, these were really, really good for that because I had a lot of thickness behind the edge, which reinforced the edge if I was using it to scrape or pry or anything like that. And obviously, if you were to try and do that with a Para 3, for example, it could get pretty spooky because this is going to thin out much more. It has so much real estate to thin out and become very thin and slicey, but this is not something that you would want to pry with necessarily or scrape really hard material. It could definitely break on you. So I still obviously love these knives, and they absolutely have a place in my collection, especially at home, but they are not... These would cause more trouble now at my new job in comparison to what I was doing before, especially because I'm doing a lot of like more slicey tasks, lots of cutting through produce and feed bags and rope and cardboard, lots of cardboard and all different types of packaging. And these blade shapes, if anything, would cause more resistance with those types of tasks. So now we get into kind of the area of like Para 3 type blade. You guys know I'm loving the Native 5 type of blade. See, again, much more height than that. We recently tested the Bug Out. That is a beautiful blade shape. Gives you plenty of room to thin out. And this is probably the shortest I would go with the Small Sebenza 31. That is getting a little closer to the area of like the 940 or the Mini A100. This is about as short as I would go, and I wouldn't want to go much thinner. The only reason that this works so well is because Chris Reeve does an incredible hollow grind. So even though this is a pretty short blade in this dimension, they really hollow out this area, so it ends up being much thinner behind the edge than it looks. And it keeps that thinness because of that. They really hollow this out. It is very, very much hollow ground. So let's just talk about why a blade shape like this is going to outperform something like this in terms of slicey tasks. A lot of you guys already know this, but if you're new to the channel, if you're new to the community, if you're new to knives and actually using your knives and, kind of getting down to like the science of what works best for what, we're just going to talk about that today. So this might be a boring video for all of you old timers, but for anyone new, we're just going to go over it. So one of the most important things to me, regardless of what I'm doing, is an actual lack of ergonomics. Although this blade shape is not going to be the best for more slicey tasks, this handle is extremely important. Nothing's stopping you from doing your cutting, especially for me when I'm cutting cardboard or packaging or anything. I want to be pretty choked up on that blade, and I also want to be able to hold this in different configurations, this one being really important. And the handle here does not stop me from doing that. So if I could have a handle as close to this as possible in my more slicey blades, that is best for me. So something like the bug out, but especially these Archon scales from Applied Weapons Tech, these very much allow me to get close to the blade. It allows me to hold this all different ways, and because these scales are just stretched out a little bit more than the original bug out scales, I'm really able to hold this all different ways and have plenty of room to move around and really utilize this blade as much as possible. Because when you get into something like the Para 3 with the original scales, you do start to get a little compromised because they tried to make them ergonomic, which actually kind of like constricts you because you have to have a pretty specific hand type for all of these curves and stuff. So I love the Para 3 very much. I'm glad that it works for my hands, but you are told what to do with this hump, going into this choil, going into this choil. It works for me, but I am going to try the skinny scales because I would like to see what happens with those without having all of these curves. So a generally straight handle works best for me for my cutting tasks because I really like to get up close to that blade and not have anything silly stopping me. And then in terms of blade shape, blade length, all of that stuff, typically around 3 inches, a little under or a little over, but typically around 3 inches is a sweet spot for me. I've noticed if I go any shorter than like 2.9, I can't actually do cutting tasks very well. So for me, and what I like to do is actually utilize the entire edge. I am not a fan of push cuts. I am not a fan of only using this specific area of the knife. I actually like to use the knife for what it was intended, and a knife really is a saw. It just has micro teeth. Like if you were to look at this under a microscope, the very actual edge is teeth. And they're tiny, and they're like this, and very close together, of course, but it's still a saw, and technically, you should be doing a sawing motion as you're moving through material. Only using one tiny area and doing push cuts all the time is just not my thing. So I really like to actually utilize the whole edge, saw through cardboard, saw through food, doing a motion like that. And if you have anything shorter than like 2.9 inches or 3 inches, you're pretty restricted with your sawing motion, guys. I mean, something like the Lil Native or whatever, like that is a tiny blade. And it just doesn't work for me because I have no room to move. And even if you're cutting through something thick, it can't even penetrate through it. It can't even move. So this type of blade shape and this length floating around 3 inches is best for me because I do a lot of trimming and cardboard cutting, and the produce, like especially cutting the butts off of the lettuce at work. I need to have a long enough blade to actually work through all of those plants. So around 3 inches, really good for me. You know, the native, I really would not to go, I wouldn't want to go any shorter than the native. Like, the blade looks longer than it actually is because the actual cutting area is only from here to here. And it's kind of deceiving because you have all of this material here, but your actual cutting edge is only that long. So I have noticed with the native, I wouldn't want to go even a hair shorter, because I really need to be able to choke up and actually saw through things, and the shorter you go, the less room you have to saw. I mean, I don't want to be like doing tiny little movements because I have nowhere to move, you know? So 3 inches, really great blade length that I've noticed for me. 3.5 inches I have tried a little bit, and that just seems to obviously blow up the entire length of the knife, and it ends up being a little too big, a little too cumbersome in the pocket, just a little too big for my hands. So I have had my hands on like a paramilitary 2 before, a Spyderco Mannix, stuff like that. They're just a little too big in general. So 3 inches is a pretty good sweet spot for like an EDC knife that you're actually going to use, that you can actually do things with without getting too big, too cumbersome, stuff like that. Locking mechanisms, also very important. Being able to open a knife one hand and close it with one hand, super, super important, especially at my job for my work. A lot of the times my other hand is compromised and I'm holding something open. I am holding, you know, a flap of cardboard on a box, and I'm trimming all of the flaps off so that we can actually see what's inside and grab the produce as we need throughout the day. So being able to open and close one-handed with ease, really important. So a frame lock absolutely works for me. Axis lock, probably the best option here, especially if you have a really smooth one like this. All of my Benchmades, for the most part, are pretty dialed in to be like swinging like that. Liner locks, absolutely fantastic. If you don't know the difference between these two, it's just the actual frame on a frame lock. That is what is contacting the blade, so the actual frame, as opposed to a liner lock where this is the liner of the knife, this is the scale, then we have the liner. That is what is contacting, so that's the difference between a frame lock and a liner lock, but they perform exactly the same. You're just pushing it over with your thumb to close the knife. Pushing it over with your thumb to close the knife. Those work great because, again, one hand opening. If we are going into back locks, it really needs to be a pretty soft back lock. I need to be able to press this in and disengage it very easily. So with the native, we are totally there. I need to be able to have this blade actually dropping when I disengage the lock, which is hard to find, at least for me. It's been really difficult for me to find back locks where they just drop shut when I disengage the lock. This one absolutely does it. So the native, this particular native for me, disengage, it starts to drop. That is great for me, one hand opening and closing. And then we have a compression lock, which is kind of like the frame lock. It's just on the back of the knife instead of underneath at the belly area. So very much the same kind of mentality, but at least for me, I use my index finger, but still one hand opening and closing. Really easy, actually. I really like compression locks. They're super useful for me. And then just kind of going over blade shapes again, I wouldn't want to go any higher than a blade like the Para 3. I mentioned this when I was testing this actual knife. This blade shape is great, but the height, it's almost a little much, and the placement of the spidey hole can restrict you with some cutting tasks, because the start of the spidey hole actually, starts here, and if it were to interfere with your cutting, you don't have a ton of, space to move here with that cutting edge in this area. There was one time where I was cutting cardboard and it was like 5 layers thick, and I literally remember trying to saw through it and the spidey hole getting stuck in it because it was too thick, and I did not have a lot of room to saw through, just with the height of this blade, the spidey hole placement, etc., etc. So I wouldn't want to go any wider than this blade. I have a Sage 5 lightweight that should be here today for testing, and that blade is pretty wide as well. It's pretty high, but I think it's also a little more elongated, so we'll test that and see how it does. It's more of a leaf shape than this. It's kind of more reminiscent of the native 5. It's much more leaf shaped. Oh, a really pretty little pigeon just landed on the fence. Hi, Pidgey! Yeah, so, the Para 3 blade shape is really, really good and super slicey and thin. It's really nice, but like I said, I think the reason why I have just a few models that I really like and use is because I'm so specific with them, and this is about as high as I would want to go for Spyderco's, and this is about as short as I would want to go for a Spyderco, and the sweet spot of all of them really is the bug out. That's kind of the ultimate blade shape right there. It's plenty long, plenty thin, not too high, nothing getting in the way in terms of cutting. Your deployment method is all the way back here, essentially touching the scale, so it's really out of the way, and you're not getting any type of interference there with anything. That's the one thing about the Spydercos that kind of can be troublesome sometimes, is just that spidey hole being so large, and it makes deployment fantastic, but that's a big hole for things to get stuck in. So these are all awesome blades, awesome blade shapes, great knives, and I really like the Spydercos. I'm really learning to love Spydercos. They just have to be pretty darn specific for me, but the thinness that they give you to move through material really is great. These 2 knives right here move through material like crazy, and the saying geometry cuts really does apply to knives like these. These knives will cut for ages because they end up thinning out behind the edge so well, and yeah, they're great. These are great EDC knives if you're cutting just a lot of material during your day. So that's kind of what I expect from my blades. That's why I have really dialed it into the types of models that I just showed you, and thinness behind the edge is why I have kind of converted to knives, or from knives, like the short and stubby Mini A100 and the 940. I've definitely kind of moved on from these to knives more like these, just for the work that I'm in right now. When I'm at home, we kind of start to gravitate back to stuff like this because I do a lot of different work at home as opposed to at my job. But if you are cutting lots of cardboard and stuff, the thin, kind of elongated, slicey blade, that's the way to go. But anyway, guys, hopefully that was informative to at least one person watching. I know that's very much a repetitive subject that we've gone over 1,000 times, but there's also a bunch of new people watching and a lot of new people coming into the community, so I just want to give my 2 cents on what blades and what blade shapes kind of work best for me at the farm right now. I think that's all I have for you guys today. Go use your shit. Go use your motherfucking shit. Use your shit. And I will see you on the next video.